BMW arguably helped start the luxury crossover craze in America, so they followed up the 1999 X5 in 2003 with the BMW X3, and this has been one of the best-selling BMWs in the US ever since. Although this looks very much like the last generation X3, 2018 actually brings us an all-new model. It's obviously important to BMW that all their models have a strong family resemblance, and that's why when you look at this vehicle, it looks like that last generation X3. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll notice that things are definitely different. We have a larger kidney grille right here. The headlamps are no longer sort of tied together with that grille. This is basically the same look that we see in the latest BMW models. And then we have slightly different fog lamps below. But again, this looks very much like that last generation model. And that seems to be exactly how X3 shoppers like it. Compared to the Lexus NX that we recently reviewed, this overall design language is definitely restrained and elegant. The model that we're driving has BMW's latest full LED headlamps. These are LED high beams and LED low beams, but you can see the turn signal right there on the end is actually an incandescent bulb. For this generation of X3, BMW decided to stretch things a little bit. So we get an overall length that is 2 inches longer than before, and a wheelbase, which is the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels, that's a little bit longer than 2 inches more than the last model. As with every generation of X3 before it, the latest generation is still a rear-wheel drive based vehicle, although all models in the US at this moment are all-wheel drive. And it was designed for BMW's inline 6 series of engines. So that's why we have this very long hood up front and this sort of shorter body behind it. Even though BMW is obviously targeting a sporty driving dynamic with the rear-wheel drive biased layout of this system, we still have 8 inches of ground clearance in the X3. Although the X3 does not have as many gadgets and gizmos targeted at off-road driving as we see, for instance, in the latest Land Rover products. As with the front end, the back end of the X3 is instantly recognizable as a BMW crossover. We have these distinctive LED tail lamp modules, and the turn signals are also LEDs, as you can see on the other side. But they are red, they're not amber for American market consumption. At the bottom of the bumper, we have twin exhaust tips, even on this 2-liter equipped model, and this is actually not a metal scuff plate. This is actually just a plastic piece that looks like metal. At the moment, there are 2 engines available in the United States. Things start out with this 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that produces 248 horsepower, and then there's an optional 3-liter turbocharged inline 6 that produces 355 horsepower. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and all-wheel drive for the moment, although we are told to expect a rear-wheel drive model coming soon. Depending on the engine and the options that you choose, your fuel economy should average between 25 miles per gallon on the high end and 23 miles per gallon if you choose the 3-liter turbo. We're told to expect plug-in hybrids and a full electric version of the X3 coming in the next year or so. Like the Jaguar F-Pace, the all-wheel drive system in this vehicle is decidedly rear-wheel biased, so under most driving conditions, it will actually be trying to send the majority of engine power to the rear wheels, not to the front wheels. That helps improve driving dynamics. Although, of course, if you need power up front, the system can send almost 100% of engine power to the front under the right conditions. That would mainly be when the rear axle has no traction. I'm going to give front seat comfort in this particular model 8 out of 10 points. This vehicle features 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable side bolsters, and a manually extending thigh cushion. Personally, I did not find these seats quite as comfortable as the seats that we see in the Volvo XC60 or the Mercedes-Benz GLC, but these are quite adjustable. And another nice touch is that the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. And that's not something we find in competition like the Lexus NX, for instance, where the passenger seat has a more limited range of motion. We also have 4-way adjustable headrests to help you find an ideal driving position. As usual, designing a vehicle is an exercise in trade-offs, and by designing the X3 to accommodate that long inline 6 engine up front, they had to give us a little bit less legroom than many of the competition. Most notably, of course, the new Infiniti QX50 and the Volvo XC60 have notably more legroom in the rear. Although sitting right here behind myself at 6 feet tall, I still have about 2 inches left. I also have a generous amount of headroom. BMW compensates for that lack of legroom by giving us a little bit more headroom than in many of the competition. Moving over to the middle seat, we have a more pronounced hump than we find in most of the front-wheel drive competition, but I definitely have a generous amount of headroom. My hair is brushing the ceiling, but it's not touching the ceiling, and our model has this large panoramic moonroof. If I move all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, you'll definitely notice that things are a little bit more compact than some of those larger entries. Even the Lexus NX, which is smaller overall than this, has more legroom with a 6'5" person sitting up front like I have this seat adjusted for. I have about ½ an inch of legroom left, but the footwells are definitely very constricted. Helping improve cargo practicality, the rear seats fold in a 40-20-40 folding fashion, so you can put large items right here. And this is almost flat with the cargo area behind it. Now, it's worth noting that if you fold this outboard seat section, this center seat does go with it. But another nice touch is that the shoulder belt actually comes out of the seat back, not out of the ceiling. That means it's a lot easier to put child seats back here and have them sit right here in the middle of the seat. It appears that when designing the X3, the engineers had a little bit more of a focus on cargo room than rear seat legroom, because we do find just under 29 cubic feet of storage back here, assuming you don't get the spare tire, because that does take up a little bit of cargo room. Despite the rear-wheel drive layout, that actually puts the X3 among the best in this segment in terms of cargo capacity. However, it is worth noting that a BMW X1 only holds about 1 cubic foot less cargo than the X3. And that really is the difference between the packaging overall for a front-wheel drive and a rear-wheel drive vehicle. From this camera angle, you can see that this rear seat back is reclined and that side is not. You can also fold the rear seats from the cargo area back here, or you can reach in through the rear doors and then release them that way. It took us a little while to figure out how to remove this roller cover from the car, so I'll share the secret with you. There's actually a little button right over here on the side. We press this button and that releases the tonneau cover from the back. Once we discovered that, removing the cover from the back is pretty easy, but where to put it is another problem, because we have the spare tire under here, and because of the spare tire's location, there's nowhere to actually put this roller cover. And it appears that there would be a place back there if you didn't have the spare. Moving to the inside, the model that we're driving has this large panoramic moonroof. Keep in mind that we are driving a nearly fully loaded 2-liter turbo model. That large panoramic roof extends all the way over there to the rear passengers' heads. Moving back over to the front, we have fixed height shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and 4-way adjustable headrests. The front seat design features these strong shoulders that you can see right there. The model that we're driving has just heated seats, so we don't have any perforations in the center, although seat ventilation is an option on the X3. You can see that we have fairly aggressive side bolsters right there. In the model that we're driving, those side bolsters are inflatable, and then we have the extending thigh cushion that you can see up front. That's a manually adjusting component in the seat. The doors and dashboard feature real wood trim, and it's a little bit difficult to tell, but between that black section on the upper part of the door and the wood trim is actually an accent light pipe that does illuminate at night, and you can alter its color. The overall styling of the dashboard is very similar to the previous generation X3. We have the latest iDrive system mounted at the top of the dashboard. This runs the same software that we recently saw in the latest BMW 5 Series model. More real wood trim below that, a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, and then a moderately sized glove compartment. If I open that right there, you can see that I was not able to fit a large tablet computer inside. This compartment is just a little bit too small. This version of iDrive supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, and this version of Apple CarPlay is wireless. So you can see I have my iPhone connected here. It is completely wireless, and it is streaming this over here to the iDrive display. What separates this from Audi's implementation of CarPlay is that we actually have a touchscreen in this version of iDrive that makes interacting with this system considerably easier than the control wheel that's the only input method in MMI. Now that we have a touchscreen in this particular system, you can actually interact with every aspect of iDrive using the touchscreen. So we can switch our inputs there to FM. You can also go back to the home menu. You can slide around to the various options, click on connected drive, etc. This is quite intuitive. Now, BMW retains the control knob in the center console with finger writing recognition, but I found myself actually touching this screen an awful lot more than I thought. Below the iDrive screen, we find the start-stop button here at kind of an interesting angle. We have 2 large air vents, a button to enable and disable the active safety systems. We can choose between all on and individual mode and all off. Then below that, we have some physical buttons for the iDrive infotainment system, mode and band right over there. We have some touch-sensitive buttons right across there. These are preset buttons that can be set to just about anything in the iDrive system. We also then have a little world icon there to take us right over to connected drive, track forward, backward, and an eject button for the single slot optical disc player. Below that, we have the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control system. There is a 3rd zone in the back in this car. We have a menu button right here, which takes you up to the climate control function setting in iDrive, where you can adjust how you want the temperature to come out of the upper vents. You can adjust the rear climate settings right there, automatic air circulation, comfort ventilation, seat and steering wheel heating, etc. Below the climate controls, we find a small storage area. It's a roller cover type, which opens to reveal a charging mat for your wireless smartphone. We also have a USB port there if you'd rather keep your smartphone right there in that slot. And then we have 2 large cup holders below that. We find basically the same shifter that we've seen in a variety of different BMW products for a while. This is a joystick style shifter. Park is a button right here. We press this unlock button and then toggle down for drive, forward for reverse. Once we're in drive, we can toggle to the left for the sport mode. We pull towards the driver for gear up, push away for gear down. To the left of the shifter, we have a traction control enable disable button. So buttons to adjust the drive mode of the vehicle. Our model does have the optional adaptive suspension. The vehicle defaults to comfort when you start. You can choose Eco Pro for a more efficient driving experience, Sport, and then you can choose Adaptive to let the vehicle decide how the system should be adjusted for you and your driving preferences. Below that, we have a Parking Sense enable and disable button that will also turn on and off the 360-degree camera system. We have a button for just the 360-degree camera system, and then we have the hill descent control button. Next to that, we have the electric parking brake, auto brake hold button, and then the controller for the iDrive system. Between the front seats, we have a padded center armrest. This opens to reveal a large storage compartment where we have an additional USB input, and definitely enough room for smartphones, keys, wallets, that sort of thing. The instrument cluster is one of BMW's latest partial LCD designs. This combines physical elements and LCD elements in kind of an interesting way. The partial rings next to the fuel level and engine temperature are physical, as is this speedometer ring from 0 over there to about 130 miles an hour, and the tachometer from about 1500 over here to 7000 RPM. Everything else that you're seeing is an LCD element, including the needles right over here for the fuel level and the engine temperature, and of course the needles right there in the middle. What makes this display interesting is that there's no plastic cover, so I can actually touch these physical rings right here, and I can actually touch the LCD right in the middle. Now, the only downside to this that I can really see is that cleaning this might be a little bit of a nightmare, especially if you live in a really dusty area where dust is collecting in here a lot, because you're actually wiping the surface of these rings and their contours as well as that center section. On the upside, this is a very attractive display. You can see that those needles change there based on the mode that you're in. In sport mode, we get a digital speedometer right here in the middle, and then we get a gear indication over here on the left. If I were to put the car in drive and then move over to manual mode, it would show you the gear that you're in. If I move to the Eco Pro mode, things turn blue, and the instrument cluster is a little bit more targeted at coaching you to drive more efficiently. The steering wheel is also one of BMW's latest designs. We have sport grips up top. The rim actually gets a little bit thinner at the top than it does at the bottom. We have a split spoke right down there, and a button to engage and disengage the steering wheel heating. On the right side of the wheel, we find a phone button, voice command button, volume up and down. Mode is for the infotainment system, and this allows us to either change the station. You can actually rotate through them using the heads-up display, or it allows you to go track forward and backward or scroll through your playlist depending on what you have connected to the system. On the left side of the wheel, we find the controls for the cruise control system. Since we're in the model without radar adaptive cruise control, we don't have those two buttons on the top or on the bottom. Behind the wheel, we have shift paddles. We have down on the left and up over there on the right. As you'd expect from BMW, 0 to 60 times in the X3 are very good for this segment. This model came in at 6.1 seconds. This is, again, the 2-liter turbocharged model that we're driving. If you want to go even faster, there is the M40i version of the X3, and that will get you 0 to 60 in 4.6, which is definitely very, very quick. That's basically the same 0 to 60 time as the GLC 43 AMG and, of course, the Volvo XC60 T8. The 6.1 second 0 to 60 was just a hair lower than the quoted 0 to 60 time for this particular trim, but in our brief test of a dealer-provided M40i version, we did verify the 4.6 second time. In our braking test, we stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 116 feet, which is quite respectable for a compact crossover like this. The model that we're driving has the optional adaptive suspension, and that does factor into the handling ability and, of course, the ride quality in the model that we're driving. And this is definitely an option that I would get. The X3 has a reputation for being one of the best handling compact crossovers in this particular segment, and that is, of course, true for the 2018 model year X3. However, being one of the best doesn't mean that the X3 is the best. I would actually say that the best in terms of overall handling, whether we're talking about a base model or upper end trims, would actually be the Stelvio or, of course, the Porsche Macan. This segment has become very, very crowded lately. We have that all-new Alfa Romeo, the new Porsche, significantly refreshed entries from just about everybody under the sun, and of course the upcoming all-new Acura RDX as well, if you want to save a little bit of money. I've found that some people that have not driven a BMW before have this expectation that a BMW is going to be very dedicated to handling and it's going to give up a little bit of comfort in other areas, but that's not actually the case. What BMW tends to excel at is making a vehicle that is incredibly well-rounded. The X3 is not going to be the fastest compact crossover. It's not going to be the best handling compact crossover. It's not going to be the one with the softest ride, etc. But it's going to do all of those things very, very well. And that's what I really like about this. It is very comfortable, it's easy to live with, but the performance is excellent, as is the handling ability. It just doesn't have that slight edge that we see in the base Stelvio when comparing the base model to that model. It doesn't have the performance that we see in the Stelvio Quadrifoglio, obviously with a massive amount more power under the hood. And it doesn't have the handling ability that we find in the Porsche Macan, but there are fewer compromises as a result in this X3. This is very, very drivable as far as daily commuting goes because we have a suspension that's nice and compliant. We have a comfort mode that we can engage that softens things out with the available adaptive suspension, or we can get the vehicle into sport mode if you want to drive it a little bit harder. And you can definitely have a lot of fun with the X3. This definitely outhandles vehicles like the Infiniti QX50 or certain versions of the Volvo XC60. The XC60 really does quite well, and depending on exactly how you've configured either vehicle, you could have an XC60 that would outhandle an X3 or an X3 that would outhandle an XC60. But of course, that Volvo won't have a rear-wheel drive power bias, and that is definitely something that we get in the X3. So this is going to drive more like a BMW 3 Series, even though this is 8 inches off the ground. Now, speaking of that 8-inch ground clearance, it's pretty obvious that this does not have the same kind of off-road focus that you'd find in a Land Rover or a Jeep that might be in the same price range as this. This is definitely more of an on-road focused crossover, but that of course means that you can have a lot more fun with this out on the road. In our cabin noise test, we scored 70 decibels at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quieter entries in this segment. Now, I did find the Mercedes-Benz GLC to be just a hair quieter out on the road, but this is quieter than the norm. In terms of overall fuel economy, this also scores very well. We've been averaging 24.8 miles per gallon over a week and about 450 miles of mixed driving. That's a very good score, especially when you consider that we get more power out of this and faster acceleration than something like a Lexus NX Hybrid. But the NX Hybrid doesn't necessarily get that much better fuel economy than the model that we're driving here. We've actually been driving that NX Hybrid back to back with this, and it gets about 2 miles per gallon better. That's not a huge difference when we're talking about a compact crossover like this. And of course, this vehicle has a true mechanical all-wheel drive system, a strong rear power bias, wider tires than we find in that Lexus NX. So you should expect this to get lower fuel economy, but what I didn't expect was that delta to be as small as it actually is. With all of that out of the way, let's dive into the pricing and see how the rest of the X3 stacks up. This pricing section is a little bit odd because the rear-wheel drive base model price that you're seeing on your screen is actually a 2019 model year price. But BMW has yet to release full pricing information for the 2019 model year. So the all-wheel drive models on your screen, those are 2018 model year vehicles. Because the X3 is so new, I don't expect 2019 prices to change too much for the all-wheel drive versions, although a slight bump is very likely. There also are no real changes to the product lineup in terms of options, features, standalone gizmos, etc. As you'd expect out of a luxury car, standard equipment is quite extensive. We get real wood trim, power front seats, a 12-speaker audio system, low-beam headlamps that are LEDs, as well as fog lamps. But because there are so many different ways you can configure your X3, we're obviously not going to dive into all of those options. But while we're here, I'll point out a few things. For instance, you'll notice that leather is not standard on the X3. Even if you move up to the $54,400 M40i model, you still don't get leather upholstery. That is an extra $1,700. You also don't get the large infotainment screen that we've been seeing in this video. That's also optional. So if you don't choose navigation from the factory, you get a 6.5-inch non-touch display. This height's one of the very important things to remember when looking at a luxury car, especially a European luxury car. There are tons and tons of options to choose from, and that can make comparisons a little bit tricky. Moving on to the takeaway, again we have those tons of options. The M40i is quite spendy, but it is a little bit less than a GLC 43, so in terms of overall value, the X3 actually does fairly well compared to some of the European competition, although it is going to be more expensive than something like the Lexus NX or the Acura RDX or the Infiniti QX50 when comparably equipped. The next important thing to know is that the M40i is not a GLC 63 competitor or the Stelvio Quadrifoglio competitor, because it is that next tier down. So it is more of a direct competitor to the likes of the GLC 43 AMG, the high horsepower Volvo option, and of course the Audi SQ5. BMW has yet to announce all of the drivetrain options that are upcoming in the X3. There will be a plug-in hybrid option coming soon with a 4-cylinder engine, an electric motor, and a battery pack probably about the same size as we see in the BMW 530e. Also, the X3 is very, very well rounded. This segment is getting very competitive, but BMW really is still trying to be everything to everyone by giving us a vehicle that performs very well in just about every aspect of its performance. But of course, performance isn't everything, so let's dive into the competition and see how it stacks up. First up, we have the Lexus NX, which we recently gave a full review. The NX was this category's best-selling vehicle in 2017, although in 2018 it looks like the Mercedes-Benz GLC is likely going to pull out a win. It's obvious when you look at the Lexus NX that it really was targeted directly at the BMW X3. Lexus did an excellent job at tuning the ride, the handling, etc. to be as good as possible with the basics of the vehicle that they started with. However, it's still not a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so even though it was targeted at the previous generation X3, I don't think it actually ended up beating the X3 in many metrics. The fact that it was targeted at the previous generation X3 should give you an idea of its relative age. At this point in time, almost all the entries in this compact luxury segment have received either a very significant refresh or a complete redesign in about the last 18 or 24 calendar months. Therefore, the NX feels somewhat old, even though it's actually not that old in terms of luxury vehicles. Luxury car companies can sometimes take 6 to 8 years to completely redesign a vehicle, and the NX is only about 3 years old. Part of the reason that the NX feels a little bit different than the X3 can also be explained by the fact that it is significantly less expensive. It's about $5,000 less in the base model. Even though the NX is notably less expensive than the BMW, it does very well when you start comparing standard features. Lexus has been very aggressive, especially at bringing their active safety technologies down to every trim. So that means that even the base NX for $5,000 less than the X3 will have standard radar adaptive cruise control, the autonomous braking system, Lexus's lane keeping assistance system, their driver awareness monitoring, and of course automatic high beams. On the downside, the BMW really does beat the Lexus NX when it comes to handling ability, the way that the vehicle drives and feels out on the road. It also feels roomier inside the cabin. Inside the cabin, we don't find Apple CarPlay or Android Auto available at any price in the Lexus NX, and the interior just feels a little bit less luxurious than what we see in the BMW X3. Next up, we have more of a direct competitor to the X3, the 2018 Mercedes-Benz GLC. The design is a little bit older than the X3, but it has held up very well even with the influx of all these new models in this segment. In an interesting twist, the Mercedes actually has a lower base MSRP than the BMW, but if you start adding options to the GLC, it can get more expensive than the BMW. That's especially true if you're looking at fully loaded models, or if you move up to the GLC 43 AMG versus the X3 M40i. BMW and Mercedes are very close when it comes to performance, specifications, and pricing, depending on exactly how you've equipped both of the vehicles. I actually like the styling of the GLC a little bit more than the X3 on the inside, and on the outside I think it's a little bit closer, but I still give the Mercedes the win there in terms of overall styling. But on the gadget front, iDrive is definitely the clear winner for me. I found it a lot easier to use, more intuitive than what we see in the Mercedes, and I really like the inclusion of that touchscreen. The two vehicles ride and handle surprisingly similarly as long as you've equipped them relatively the same. Although I prefer the way that the X3 drives just a little bit more than the GLC. I don't really care for the way that the Mercedes-Benz transmission shifts, and the ZF 8-speed that we find in the BMW really is an excellent transmission. If, however, you're looking for the most comfort in this particular segment, then the GLC is an excellent option because you can get it with Mercedes' full four-corner air suspension that adjusts not only the ride height of the vehicle, but it makes it significantly softer than just about every other entry here. Next up, we have the Audi Q5. Thanks to the standard dual-clutch transmission, the Q5 is surprisingly quick, even in base form. It's also very well priced because all-wheel drive is standard, as is leather upholstery. That means that if you were to simply comparably equip a BMW X3 to the Audi Q5 with those two options, you would end up several $1,000s more expensive than the Audi. And of course, the value proposition gets even better if you start looking at the gadgets that are standard on the Q5. For instance, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto are in even the base model. But when you start taking a look at other metrics, the X3 and the GLC actually pull away from the Q5 when it comes to handling. That difference is definitely noticeable if you start pushing both vehicles harder out on your favorite winding mountain road. When it comes to gadgets, I think it's a little bit of a split, because the MMI system that we find in the Q5 and the SQ5 is not as easy to use, as intuitive as the touchscreen iDrive system that we find in the BMW. However, the Audi full LCD instrument cluster that we see optional in the Q5 is more interesting, and I think a better gadget really, than the partial LCD instrument screen that we find in the X3. Audi has done an excellent job with the design of that LCD screen, and the Google satellite imagery really is impressive. Of course, you will have to pay extra for that Google satellite imagery after an initial trial period, because it does require their data services in order to keep that up. If we move up to the SQ5, the Audi is about the same price as the BMW, but it offers a little bit more content for the same money. But performance actually becomes a little bit of a problem for the SQ5. Instead of beating manufacturer-provided 0 to 60 estimates like we see out of the BMW, the Mercedes, and even the Volvo XC60 T8, the SQ5 actually took notably longer to get up to highway speeds. It was obviously closer if you used launch control, but we weren't using launch control when we were testing the M40i or the GLC 43 or the Volvo T8. Speaking of the XC60, Volvo has always marched to a slightly different drummer, and that's definitely true for the XC60. And I'm not just talking about the fact that it starts out as a front-wheel drive crossover, not a rear-wheel drive crossover like we find in the BMW and the Mercedes. It has to do with the way the suspension's tuned, the overall styling of the vehicle and its interior, the options that Volvo has chosen to put standard and optional on the vehicle. In general terms, Volvo has tuned the XC60 towards the more comfortable side of this particular segment, but they have paid a lot of attention to pushing as much weight to the rear of the vehicle as possible, and that's also noticeable when you start comparing it to something like the Acura RDX or the Lexus NX. The Volvo actually behaves more like the Audi Q5 than those other vehicles that have a stronger front weight bias. Obviously, that means that handling is dynamically not going to be in the same place as the X3 or the GLC, but the Volvo does very well for itself when you're comparing a comparably priced XC60 to a comparably priced BMW. Volvo's high horsepower solution is also a little unusual, because instead of sticking a bigger engine under the hood like we find in the GLC or the Audi or the BMW, Volvo sticks an electric motor in the back and a plug-in hybrid system. The result is an XC60 that can certainly accelerate like a GLC 43 and is very, very close in terms of acceleration to the M40i, but the way that it behaves and feels out on the road is quite different. Not just because of the plug-in hybrid nature, of course, but because most of that power is going to the front axle, and then only a small portion of the power is actually going to the rear electric motor. But if you're after rapid acceleration, a very comfortable cabin, Volvo has easily the most comfortable seats in this segment, with available seat massage and a ton of different features that we don't find necessarily in the BMW, then the Volvo is a very good option. And fuel economy is very impressive even in that top-end plug-in version. It's just not going to be as much fun as the X3 M40i. Overall, my top picks in this segment have to be the XC60, the GLC, and the BMW X3. But if I had to cut things down to just two, it would actually be the Volvo and the BMW. The BMW is a very, very well-rounded car in this segment. As you can see, it doesn't excel in every metric, but it does very, very well in every metric. But that's not why the Volvo is on this list, because the Volvo is full of highs and sort of medium highs. It has a very comfortable interior, performance is very good, but handling obviously falls just a little bit behind the rear-wheel drive competitors. However, it does a good job at giving shoppers an excellent value, because it is priced more like the Audi Q5, but I think the interior is more comfortable, it feels more homey, more open, definitely more luxurious and different than what we see in the German entries. So if you're looking for all-around value, comfort, or interestingly enough luxury touches, then the Volvo wins, especially the top-end model with the stitched leather dashboard, the massaging front seats, etc. But if you're looking for a well-rounded vehicle that's going to cost perhaps a little bit more than a comparable Volvo, then the BMW X3 is my top pick in this segment. I would pick it over the GLC, even in the GLC 43 AMG versus M40i debate, and I would definitely pick the X3 over the current generation Audi Q5 or SQ5. I'd also pick the BMW over the Audi Q5 and SQ5, and even though it's not going to handle quite like an Alfa Romeo Stelvio, it does so much better than the Stelvio in other areas like creature comforts, the way the gadgets work, etc., that I would buy the X3 over that Alfa as well. Be sure and let me know what you think about that and what your top pick in this segment would be down there in the comments section below. You can also head over to facebook.com/AlexNautos to see what we're driving this week and what video is coming up next. And if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, you can click up there and go to patreon.com and donate to this channel. I'll see you later.